for more on Vice President Kamala Harris's visit, and this we are joined by Africa analyst Gideon Chitanga. Gideon, a pleasure to have you on the program this evening. Now, human rights campaigners around the world have condemned the new move to enact the harsh law, some describing it as hate legislation in Uganda. But before we go there, let's speak firstly about the significance of Kamala Harris's visit here on the continent. Why would you say this has been important for Washington?
Well, I think it illustrates a clear shift in Washington's policy towards Africa from a historical posture that was mainly premised on donor aid and a perspective of Africa as a crisis region, which was, I think, treated as part of the backyard of the U.S. and more associated with Western humanitarian intervention. But we know that from the past 2 years, and particularly during Biden's presidency, there's been a lot of rethinking of U.S. foreign policy towards Africa. And I think this visit, which is the 18th visit by a senior U.S. official to the African continent, and part of, I think, visits by U.S. officials to about 11 countries since January. It shows that the U.S. policy is shifting. There is an underlying geopolitical context, and you referred to it, the sense that China and to a lesser extent Russia have become extremely influential to Africa, and Africa remains a major source of strategic resources, but it's also becoming an important voice geopolitically on critical matters in multilateral institutions. So there's a sense in which Washington is making a serious effort to try and counter Chinese influence in China and Russian influence in China post the conflict in Ukraine, but at the same time, efforts to realign their policies. You actually now hear, in terms of rhetorical posture, a language that stresses more mutual benefits, much like what China says, more partnerships grounded in investment, bringing in capital and American companies to invest in African countries. So this is a pattern that we are likely to witness, I think, for a long time. The second part is that obviously Zambia and Ghana, they are highly indebted countries, African countries, and part of that is the debts they owe to China. And there's this battling about the process of restructuring the loans. And China has said that it would prefer an approach that would consider all the debts that are owed by these countries to different multilateral institutions and not necessarily a debt that is Chinese. And the U.S. is playing, I think, a very delicate game in trying to demonstrate that it's a close ally, close partner to these two countries and the rest of the African continent in the context of what they've called debt diplomacy. So the accumulation of debt to African countries from China, which sort of disempowers them and subordinates them to Chinese economic interest. And China has said this type of diplomacy is actually an invention from the U.S. and Western countries. Its focus is mainly mutually beneficial partnerships, as has been spread, I think, across the continent. So we are likely to see U.S. policy at two levels, competing against China, and certainly more and more trying to muscle in its influence based on a recalibrated policy posture in the African continent, which will translate into a growing American reach and presence in the continent.
Now, Gideon, let's also shift gears here and focus on developments around these protests against Uganda's anti-homosexuality bill. I mean, when looking at the proceedings in Uganda's parliament, just 2 MPs from the ruling party in Uganda actually oppose this new legislation. Let me remind our viewers that this is also a conservative Christian country, and homosexual sex was already punishable by life imprisonment. More generally, what does this tell us about this hardline stance in Uganda's society against homosexuality in this East African nation?
So I think that it's a common pattern that you see in a number of countries. Previously in Zimbabwe, also in Kenya and other African countries, which are either very traditionally African in posture in terms of the political posture that is taken by the political leaders, and some who claim Christian conservative postures, but in both ways trying to say homosexuality is alien in the African continent, and therefore in aligning their political goals in a very calculated ways with the majorities of the populations who still shun open homosexuality as an open practice. I think there is a bit of political leverage to extract or to attain by passing such hardline laws in countries where the majority of people would probably support such positions or would just quietly accept what would have been said. There's also a bit of the backlash. There is a bit of the often what I would call ambivalence in the U.S. in terms of championing LGBT rights. So it's a big question and a huge challenge, a threat to the human rights of the LGBT communities, I would say. But I think African countries are moving slowly, cautiously, and I think in a very politically calculated ways, where they believe that the broader society, like in Uganda, the majority of the people, particularly in the rural areas, would still take the position that the political elites and the establishment has taken, and therefore they would pass such laws which are punitive and surely do not protect the rights of the LGBT communities. But it's not a universal thing. South Africa has a fairly more open and tolerant constitution, and you find that a lot of members of these communities, they come to South Africa to seek refuge here, and some of them end up going to Western countries. So I think it's a problem that African countries will continue to deal with, probably will take a long time to address, and issues of sexual orientations, they are not issues that are openly discussed in a lot of rural traditional communities in the African society. So it's something that has to do with the moral norms and the customs in these societies, and I think change will take quite a long time.
Now, an earlier version of the bill prompted widespread international criticism and was later nullified by Uganda's Constitutional Court on procedural grounds. Now, the bill will now go to President Yoweri Museveni, who can veto or sign it into law. Now, in a recent speech, he appeared to express full support for this particular bill.
Yes, President Museveni has, on different occasions, he expressed himself as opposed to human rights kind of laws, which support open expression and orientation amongst the LGBT communities. My suspicion is that he will probably sit on the bill or pass it, depending on his calculation. I don't think that Uganda really listens much to what the international community says, and probably they will look at the costs in terms of Western donor aid, if they will continue to get it, and if there are some kind of sanctions if they persist on the route of passing these laws. But I think I should emphasize that there is a kind of a tension for those who believe in African traditional customs and traditional practices that emanates primarily because sexual orientation issues, they are quite a private matter, and they are kept behind closed doors. It's not a subject that you openly discuss, and when it gets to LGBT communities, it becomes even such a big taboo. So I understand this idea of wanting to keep these practices out of the public, but not necessarily the issue of being punitive and the government taking a position to punish them. I think that African countries are still hard pressed with other priorities, and secondly, this is an issue that is certainly not a major priority on the agenda of a lot of African governments. So punishing it then makes it a priority, and then it raises a question why a government would then want to legislate at such a level. I guess some people would say it's better to leave private matters in private spaces, and government gets out of legislating individual sexual orientations in that manner, which is repressive.
Now, bearing this in mind, what will this mean, especially for people living in Uganda who are part of the LGBTQ plus community?
There are a lot of cases of Ugandan LGBT communities, individuals who have left the countries because they felt that their private safety was compromised in the sense of being targeted. But obviously, once a government takes such a posture, then it seriously means that those members of such communities then becomes targets of the state. And so there is a choice to live in the country and continue to engage with the government and other institutions of the law, of the civil society to try and influence change. But it's still quite risky because the security concerns do not only come from the government. Once government has passed the law, then criminal actors who might take the law into their hands also become proactive, citing state regulations as prompting punitive action against these individuals, and some are attacked by organized sectors of the communities which might be religious or non-religious, but just homophobic communities. So I think there is already a huge risk for members of these communities, and the chances are that we'll see a lot of them running out of the country to seek refuge in other countries. The problem is that the biggest, safest country would be Kenya, but Kenya has also moved towards that direction. And I think a number of African countries might be influenced to to legislate against LGBT communities, which would be really a problem for these communities and their family members.
Gideon, let me thank you very much for your time. That's Gideon Chitanga. He's an Africa analyst speaking to us about a number of issues, including U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris's visit, making her last stop in Zambia this time, and also growing support for against Uganda's plan to implement this particular bill, or its anti-homosexuality bill.